Russia fights until it can't. It has never backed down from a war without at least 500,000 battlefield deaths. Right now, we're probably only at about 50,000. That doesn't mean it doesn't have implications. If you take the three belligerents together, treat them as a single economic entity, which I think we really need to in wartime, everything in the first column, they are collectively the world's largest supplier, second largest in the second, and so on. Now, each one of these is an hour-long presentation, so I'm going to talk about three real quick that are not at the core of your world, and then we're going to move on to your world. So first of all, the world's largest wheat exporter has invaded the world's fifth largest wheat exporter and is cognizant about its active destruction of the entire agricultural base. Ukraine is going to end up being a food importer sometime next year, most likely. That is going to have catastrophic consequences throughout the global system, but it's nothing compared to what's happening with fertilizer. Russia is the world's largest supplier. Russia plus Belarus specifically provide 40% of the world's potash. Natural gas is the primary input for nitrogen fertilizers. And South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia, every single country in all of those regions imports almost all of their potash and all of their phosphate. This is how we get a famine. We have been extraordinarily lucky this year. Mother Nature has been very kind. There are record harvests throughout most of the world to compensate for the loss of Ukraine. But the damage to the fertilizer system has already been done, and we will get hit with that next year. Building new phosphate systems takes a decade. We will not recover from this quickly. And by the time we have recovered from it, we will have lost a few 100 million people. Neon, you guys have all seen Star Wars, right? Yeah, I'm sorry, wrong Star Wars. Not like lightsabers, but Reagan. Back at the 1983 Reykjavik summit, Gorbachev and Reagan almost got rid of nuclear weapons. And almost on his way out the door, Gorbachev was like, oh yeah, and there's just one catch to make this all happen. You have to get rid of Star Wars. And Reagan's like, nope. So it kind of fell apart, and we went from there. Gorbachev went back to the Soviet Union. It was like, okay, this is the future of great power competition, space lasers that provide a missile shield. So they didn't have the technology to do the space lasers, but it was still the Soviet Union, a lot of power, so they put a lot of effort into building out the supply chain that they would need once they stole the technology. Part of that's neon. You use neon to focus the laser aperture. Soviet Union fell apart, but not before this system was built. Today, we use neon to focus the laser apertures for semiconductor fabrication facilities. Here's the problem. 80% of the world's neon comes from the former Soviet space. Oh, it's worse than that. Because in Russia, at their steel foundries, you have a first stage, what's called an air separation unit, that breaks the air into three chunks: oxygen, nitrogen, and everything else. And then you use the first two tanks to blow into the system to get the temperature gradient you're after. That third tank, everything else, is then sent to a second, more advanced facility where it separates out the argon and the helium and the neon. The steel facilities are all in southern Russia. They're losing access to global markets because of sanctions and the war. A lot of them have shut down. The second stage facilities are all in either Odessa, which hasn't had reliable electricity in 4 months, or Mariupol, where it was leveled. We've already lost 80% of global supply. Which means that pretty soon we get to decide where we put our neon for purposes of making semiconductors. The other 20%, that's all in China. Now, China doesn't make the high-end microprocessors. They do the low-end. So if you want like a margarita machine that sings when the slush is at the right churn, that's a Chinese chip. You want to do something useful, that's an American chip. And since the Chinese now control all of the world's remaining supply, what do you think they're going to prioritize? Now, the technical economic term for this sort of situation is fuck. Okay, that's a taste of the problems everyone else has to deal with. Let's talk about yours. What we've got here is a map of the physical infrastructure for the energy sector in the former Soviet space. Green is oil, red is natural gas. For starters, we're going to talk about oil, specifically the ports. These are the two facilities, Primorsk in the north, Novorossiysk in the south, that are the two largest export points for Russian and former Soviet crude. Here's the problem. The southern one is in a war zone. That makes it a little sketchy in terms of insurance. Speaking of insurance, you guys get insurance more than most crowds. You cannot have a ship go in or out of any port or any congested waterway without an insurance policy. The European Union and the United States have made it impossible for Russian chartered ships to get insurance, and as of January of next year, that applies to all Russian cargoes. Which means the Russians have to self-insure their own stuff. They don't have the facilities to do that. So if one ship is hijacked, confiscated, violates an OSHA regulation, something, that's 5 million barrels a day that suddenly can't sail. And this is not Texas. This isn't even Alberta. Russian crude comes out of the permafrost. And for those of you who are from the north, not the Texans obviously, you know that in winter, as long as you're moving, you will live. But if you stop, you will freeze to death. Same thing with Russian crude in the permafrost. If the flow stops, the crude turns to gel. The water that comes up as a byproduct freezes in the pipes. And everything from the wellhead to the pumps themselves cracks. And you have to replace the whole damn thing. The last time this happened, it was 1992, and it took the Russians 30 years to bring it all back online. They only finished last December. So we could have Latvia grab one oil tanker, and this all just stops. 5 million barrels a day. Let's talk about the Chinese. On the left, the little rainbow graphic there, that's where crude comes to the Northeast Asian space. Purple is from the Americas, yellow is from West Africa, blue is from the former Soviet space, and the big old red, that's from the Persian Gulf. On the right is where West African crude goes. Orange goes, I'm colorblind all of a sudden. Green goes primarily to the European space, and then that lower one of the yellows goes primary to Asia. What has happened because of self-sanctions in Europe is the Europeans have stopped using Russian crude wherever they can, and instead they're gobbling up most of what's available out of West Africa. They're taking stuff that used to come for us, it's not a big deal for us anymore. A lot of that is light sweet, we got plenty of that. What this has done is reordered crude flows around the world. It used to be that most consumers would use the crude that was relatively proximate. That's what the refineries were designed for. Now, everything is stretched out because the Europeans are taking stuff that used to go to China, and since the Chinese are at the very end of the world's longest supply lines, they don't have the economic or military power to project out and change that, but the Europeans do, especially when it involves